making this Susannah Quilt block. It's a 12.5-inch block, finishing in your quilt at 12 inches. And it's pretty easy. It's made mostly of squares, except in the center there's a diamond in the square block. And I'll be fussy cutting that center, and I'll show you a real easy way how to do that fussy cutting. So let's get started, and I'll show you how to make it. You can see the patches that make up the block, again, mainly squares all around the edges. And then, as I mentioned, here's the center diamond in a square patch, and here's the fussy cut center right here. You'll choose 3 fabrics, 1 for your center and then 2 coordinating fabrics. For my coordinating fabrics, for the outer squares, I'll cut 8 squares at 3.5 inches. And then my inner squares of my blue, I'll cut 4 squares at 3.5 inches. And then in addition, out of the blue, I'll cut 2 squares at 4 inches. And those will be used to construct this patch, the diamond in the square patch. For the center, cut 1 square at 4 3/4 inches. And I'm doing what's called fussy cutting. I want this trailer that's on my fabric to be right in the center of the square. And I also want the square to be in the block in the diamond shaped or on point. So now I'll show you how to cut this out really easily. Out of freezer paper, you'll cut your square at 4 3/4 inches. And if you haven't used freezer paper, it's really a cool product for quilting, and there's even some tips on this particular box for applique and crafts. And so all I simply did was cut 1 square of this at 4 3/4 inches. And the freezer paper has one side that feels like paper, and then the other side is more shiny. And that shiny side is the side that will adhere with your iron. Using your iron, it will adhere to the fabric. I have my fabric that I want to fussy cut right on my pressing surface. Here's the trailer that I want to fussy cut. I'll take my 4 3/4 inch square of freezer paper, and then the shiny side down. I'll position it over that trailer, and again, I want it to be on point. And you can see right through it. On the camera, I know it doesn't show up, but I can see right through it. So I'll just position that paper right over my trailer and just try to center it the best I can. I'll use my iron and just press that paper right onto the fabric. Now I'll cut out my fussy cut square. I'll just remove my excess fabric. And using my ruler, I'll just carefully line it up and cut. And I'll remove the freezer paper. And there's my diamond shaped, centered trailer ready to use in my block. And I did want to mention that you can reuse this. If you want to make a bunch of blocks, it'll still adhere to your fabric over and over. Now to construct this diamond in a square, we'll use our 2 blue 4-inch squares. And I'll line these 2 up and cut them diagonally. Now I will fold this in half, just trying to find the center of my sides. And you can finger press, or I have this roller from Violet Craft. And now my center is there. And I'll repeat that. And I'll also do it on the other sides. And now I'll take my triangles and I will center them on my square, and I'll actually fold it with the right side out. And again, I'll just put a little crease right there. And then I'll match up my creases like so. Oops. And pin. And then I'll do the opposite side. And I'll take it to the machine and I'll sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance here and here. I have my 1/4 inch presser foot, and I'm not using a leader fabric here because I'm starting so far in. And then I'll repeat that right down here. And press. And I'm pressing away from the center. And I'll place the other triangles on each of my other sides. Just line up those creases just like I did before. And pin. And I'll take it to the machine, and off camera I'll do the same exact thing. 1/4 inch seam allowance right along here and here. Again, press. I'll set my seams. Give it a little finger press. And ideally you want these to come out nice and even. They look really good. If they don't, that's okay because we are going to trim this patch down a little bit. So there's a little bit of wiggle room there. And I'll now square up the patch to 6.5 inches. And I'll use my square up ruler from Quilt in a Day. Use whatever square up ruler you like. And so what I'll try to do is line up this point and this point at 3.25 inches on my ruler. So here's 3.25 and here's 3.25. Now I'll flip it around and I'll cut these two sides. Again, I'll line up this point here and this point here at 3.25, which is half of 6.5. And hopefully it'll line up nicely. There's my 3.25 and 3.25. And then you'll also want to line up at 6.5. Now all you do is lay out your squares around the center. And then to assemble it, I'll just do, it'll be basically 3 rows. This will be a row, this will be a row, and this will be a row. So I'll just pin. And as I always show in my other videos, I like to pin in the direction that I'm sewing. So this just means that I'll start sewing here and then this way. And it's just a rough pin to remind me which direction to sew. And then I'll also pin these. I'll take these to the machine and I'll sew all of them, this time with a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. And this time I'll use my leader fabric, again my 1/4 inch presser foot. And I have it, my needle set for a scant 1/4 inch. Make sure they stay lined up. And this is just called chain piecing, and I will just keep on feeding these through without cutting my thread. Okay, now I have all of these sewn together. And I'm not going to press these just yet, but I did press these on each side toward the blue. So that's my darker fabric. So you can see there and there. I just pressed it in that direction. Now I will attach these like so and pin. And I'll do the same thing, a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance here and here. And this is just important that you match up this point here with your seam. Instead of pinning right here, I'm going to go ahead and use my glue stick. This is a sew line glue stick, washes right out. So I'll just put a dab right here. And then I'll just carefully match up this seam right at this point right here. And line it up and then just give it a pinch. I'll make sure my ends are nicely lined up. Feed it right in, just keep it aligned. And I'll remove my pin. And I'll check and make sure it's lined up. And you can see it's lined up pretty nicely, so I'll leave it. And then I'll repeat that on the other side. Same thing, a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance right down here. I'll set my seam and I'll press away from the center. Now that this is pressed, I will just take this over to the iron and off camera I will give it a press. And I'll just make sure I'm pressing this seam and this seam and this and this in the opposite direction of what these are pressed. So these are pressed outward and I'll press these inward. And again, I'll just do that off camera. Then I will just simply join this row to the center and this row to the center. And I'll use my glue stick to match up my seams, just like I did before. Just put a dab of glue on there and match up the seam. And then I'll repeat that on my other seams. And I have the seams all glued. So now I'll just, again, scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I just always like to make sure my seams don't get folded under or anything. And I'll sew my other seam off camera. And I'll give it a final press, set my seam. And again, I'm pressing away from the center. Just seems easier for me. And the final measure, 12.5 inches square. There you have it, the Susannah Quilt block with a really easy fussy cut center. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.